Okay, so today I wanted to kind of continue in our neuroimaging data series by specifically talking about eye tracking. And eye tracking is a method essentially of seeing where people are directing their visual attention. And it has particularly interesting applications when it can be combined with neuroimaging data. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what eye tracking data is, how you can combine it with neuroimaging data, and basically some of the benefits and pitfalls that I've experienced working combining the two.
Why you never want to try to do it.
I will try to convince you a little bit that there's a lot of value in the data, but you really have to think about using it. So we'll cover that a little bit. So first I just wanted to kind of give a very nuts and bolts overview of kind of like what is eye tracking, what is an eye tracker. So there's basically two key elements to the eye tracker. So one is an infrared emitter, and usually this is mounted to like a computer monitor or it's a small bar, and it basically bounces infrared light off, the face and ostensibly the eyes of the person performing the experiment. And then additionally, there's a specific IR camera that picks up what the infrared image that was recorded was. And the way that those two combine to get real eye tracking data is for each eye, there's a computer vision model that is essentially designed to take the comparison between the iris and the white of the eyes, the sclera, and essentially have an idea of where that circle is, and then between the iris and the pupil. And that basically gives you the size and also an approximate orientation of where that person's eye is looking, where it's fixating. The main problem, and the thing that'll come up again later when we talk about issues with this kind of data, is the main difficulty is you're always trying to locate that pupil. So if you have extreme orientations, the models kind of break down, and then there's a lot of dealing with when you blink naturally, you have no pupil visible, and so there's a lot of kind of computer vision engineering problems that get addressed. The other kind of piece in this data modeling is once you have an idea of where the pupil is and solve that problem, you have to also figure out where it's actually looking. And basically from this first model, you can infer where people are looking, kind of a direction of gaze, but then that also has to get projected from this 3D space, this viewing angle that we all have that's an arc onto a flat screen. So those are the main two engineering problems with an eye tracker. And with successive generations of eye trackers, that quality of data has improved over time. But this really gives us a sense of where people are really looking. A lot of our experimental and cognitive paradigms focus on directing attention. With an eye tracker, you have much greater certainty about where they're actually looking. There's a whole bunch of technologies that have come out. It's been a lot of development. It feels like there's a new eye tracker every 6 months, and a bunch of different setups. So some of the earliest designs, which are still heavily in use, are these kind of chin rest eye trackers, where essentially you help solve a lot of the data problems by having the person put their chin on a chin rest and not move their head very much, and just move their eyes. As you imagine, that's not very useful for your average research subject, certainly not your average adolescent or kid. It's begun moving in this kind of more wearable dimension, and now they're even trying to do eye tracking in a VR setting. There's a lot of benefits of these head-mounted eye trackers, but the problem is, as you might imagine, there's a lot of stuff to put on someone's face. And if we're studying development, some of these technologies might work. What's more often used is either these portable emitters and cameras that just attach below a screen or next to a laptop, or these more inset devices where it's kind of built into its own monitor. So there's a lot of different ways to measure them. I have the most experience and exposure to these latter models. The benefit of these top ones is they strap to the head, so you're not going to lose their eye gaze very often. These are much less invasive. It's also easier to combine these guys with something like EEG or F-NIRS. Okay, so what an eye tracker gives you basically is a whole series of data for each eye, as well as some information about how well the eye was tracked. And you get it at a really high frequency. It's like 33 milliseconds on average for most trackers. Ours can even be set way down low. So you can get a lot of information about where people are looking very quickly.
Do you mean you get a data point each 33 milliseconds?
Yes, or 33 or greater. So as you imagine, there's a lot of data being gathered. And I'll talk a little bit about data sampling frequency in a bit. So you get this massive data set, and typically from that initial data set, you end up condensing the data down because it's just too much. And the most frequent way that it's condensed is to break down all these gaze points into what's called a fixation.
So,
Uh-huh.
so is this for every type of eye tracker, or is it just yours that you guys use?
Most of the so the sampling frequency can vary a little bit by model. Most of them are around there. The type of data that comes out of the eye tracker is pretty simple and similar, but like the technology that you use to gather it varies a lot. But basically, the data that comes out is very, very similar. So what's a fixation? I keep talking about that. So basically what happens is, as you're going through the protocol, you get a bunch of little data points, and they're nested close to each other. So within the computer software, essentially, you decide a certain radius or distance from each point that you sort of say these data all are basically looking in the same general area. And so those are lumped together into fixations. And in between each fixation, you have these jumps that your eye makes to a new area. You have a new set of fixations. So this is just a graph of a very similar thing. So you have a bunch of gaze points in a similar area, and then you have this jump, which you call a saccade, to a new set of fixation points. So
What's the unit measure? So like, what would the y-axis be? Is it like an x-y coordinate or something on the screen?
Yeah. This is in one dimension, x dimension in this case.
And it combines them? Sort of thing?
Yeah, it would be x and y. This is just to make it easier to see visually,
but
but
it's actually x and y coordinates.
yeah, it's x and y coordinates.
How do you gauge when it's moving to a new fixation point? What if it's just two fixation points that are very close?
Yeah, so that's usually arrived at by there's a certain number of millimeters of radius that are defined. You can have a situation where you have two fixations close to each other, and so if that amount is increased or changed, those might be counted as one big fixation in an area. There's a couple of papers that kind of give different options about fixation filters. So it's really just how it's set. So it doesn't, what you're counting as a fixation is a decision that you're making, not necessarily like a property of the actual data.
Because eyes always moves a little bit like that, because
Yeah.
otherwise the image would disappear. Physiologically, it has to do that.
Yeah.
So when is this looking at one
Yeah.
thing versus,
Yeah.
and so there are some sort of default definitions of what a fixation is, and most people are using pretty similar kind of it's like a radius, and this radius for this amount of time, we'll call it a fixation. And this is the beginning of fixation, and they're still within that, and okay, now they're over here, now that's fixation is over.
Well, I imagine that's a good reason to be really standardized in how you're setting up this type of experiment. So
Yeah.
you want to make sure that, like, the projection magnification, however you're doing that, is the same across participants. The distance from the screen is the same across participants.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll be plumbing a little bit further into some of those kinds of issues, but yes, this is another thing where a lot of standardization in your data is really important. The nice thing about a lot of the modern suites, including the ones that we use for data processing, is your rawest form of data is always stored. So if you want to change something like your fixation filter size, you can go back to your data and produce that very easily.
Right, so there's a stream, if you got 250 hertz, you have 250 data points every second, and that's stored somewhere. But then there's usually some software that says, okay, this is a fixation, this is a fixation.
Yeah.
And you can go, if you want to go into the guts of it for any reason, you want to say, well, I think that we should define a fixation differently because of what your experiment is or what the age or something like that. You can go in and do it, but it would be like going into MATLAB and changing it.
Yeah. So this is just kind of broadly what the data kind of looks like. So this is one way, and usually the earliest form of classification of the data that you can use. The other two are basically two different region of interest approaches. So if we think of our raw gaze data over here, and then you can have these setups where basically in your design interface you can draw a circle around each of the faces of the members of KISS here, and each one, if a gaze fixation falls within that area, it'll record when that happens and for how long. And you can get very sophisticated with this as well and define subregions. So like in this face, there's this red eye region, a green nose bridge region, and a blue mouth region. The main restrictions with these are just the time required to generate more specific regions of interest, and also a little bit about how big the image is. So if you're very interested in how people scan through a face, your experimental stimulus needs to occupy a lot of the visual area or be a very large face for you to ask those kinds of questions. So these approaches are pretty robust, and there's some simple ways to report that data and more complex things that you can analyze. But generally, most eye tracking studies tend to use one or the other or a combination of the two approaches in running their data. So while a lot of the eye tracking software suites are expanding their features, most of them are centered around experimental design and data collection or data evaluation. So once you get your stream of data, whether that's raw gaze or fixations, or whether or not they're looking at a region of interest or for how long, all that processing is typically done in third-party software. So you tend to export that data out and analyze it in something like SPSS or Stata for kind of your more basic stuff. And then if you're doing kind of more advanced analysis or you're more familiar with them, R or MATLAB are commonly used for this data. There's some approaches also that have started to use multi-level modeling approaches. So since you have like trials, you can look at patterns within a trial, within individuals, and you can use a lot of the density of your data, the high sampling rate, to ask more nuanced questions there. That's still very much in the infancy because a lot of the eye tracking technology keeps improving and changing. The most common way you'll see eye tracking data represented, especially in papers and visualizations, even if their analysis is just with the data, they tend to use either heat maps or path diagrams. And these are basically just two ways to visualize or conceptualize what your data actually looked like.
Wait, can I ask a question
Yep,
about
sure.
the heat map? Usually when people do the heat maps, it's for one individual, it's sort of
Mhm.
illustrative, right?
Mm-hmm.
It seems like you could take this, like an image like this,
Mm-hmm.
and treat it like you would treat an MRI image, right? Put it
Mhm.
together and just all the groups, and you could find areas, an area that are different. Does anyone do that?
Yeah, I think that's one area where you can kind of move through. So I'll touch on this a little bit when I get into the real data, but the idea being that you can like pick out one stimuli and do where everybody looked most frequently in the image.
Or if you have two groups?
Yeah, or if you have two
Are there
groups.
differences in how much an anxious group focuses on the eyes versus a non-anxious group or something like that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've seen it done a lot with a single image, or if your stimuli are always constrained, so faces always fall in the same place, then they put a face stimuli underneath and then
Usually
they show
that
the
does
whole
it
graph.
quantitatively, so you have an
Yeah.
ROI and a number of
Yeah.
fixations, but you could even do it with an image. And sort of
Absolutely.
without any a priori interest, just are there differences in the group?
Yeah. I've seen less of the group differences implementation, but there's no reason you couldn't do that, because you just would get a density value and compare them
Right,
between the
it's
two
just
groups.
like the image value.
Yeah. So let me delve a little bit into these. First, I'll talk a little bit about path diagrams. So here's a little bit of a visualization of kind of what Eric was touching on earlier when he was talking about your eyes move around a lot. So they've used a blur here to kind of illustrate this is the area that you're foveating or focusing on in this first fixation here, and here's the second. So this gives you a sense, this is the area where your eye can really see very well with a lot of visual acuity, and here after you've moved is this. So this is just one way to kind of look at what area you're really directing your attention. And so what happens with a path diagram is essentially you have your first fixation point and you draw a line to the second. And when you move into a more advanced set, you'll notice that a lot of my examples tend to be advertising things. This is one of the most lucrative areas for eye tracking, is looking at where people look on food labels and visual scenes. So in this case, you have a series of fixations. This is from a single subject where they basically scan through the image. And often in path designs, the larger the sphere, the longer that they've been looking in that area. So you can do things like, okay, in this sequence, how many fixations was it before they looked at the fish here? Or how long did it take them to get to this point? So you can get some sense. There's secondary data that you can analyze with that. The other approach you can kind of take with these is the shotgun approach. And this is an example of everybody's visual search through all of the images in the sequence with a lot of different subjects. You lose some information in this approach, but you can also see if there's a lot of people clustering with low numbers in a particular area. And this kind of information is actually what then starts to move towards heat maps, because as you can see, there's a certain density of gaze points in there. So if we look at a heat map, this is kind of a little bit what you were alluding to of a comparison of two groups. So in this example, there's a comparison of two different website designs. So this is the first design and this is the second. If you look here, darker red values are areas where they were looking longer. So in this case, there was a lot of focus up here in this design, but there was more scanning of different articles in this approach. So the heat map gives you a quick visual look. It's a little less confusing than this cloud of dots here. But it gives you an idea of really where people were looking and where they centered their gaze. Sure.
How do you create the heat map?
So a little bit of it's based on, often it's within a calculation within like a program. So like a lot of the visualization suites, like the eye tracking suites, you can ask it to do it for you. I've implemented an approach to doing a heat map in R. Basically, the important thing is you need to decide how big of a like how big of a space you're considering, and then you need to compute densities for the whole group in that area. But that's not too bad.
So
But
in,
it's a
in
little bit
Toby,
addictive.
what is the
Yeah.
eye tracker we have here, they actually, will, part of the processing, run at an individual subject level, they don't do it for group level, I don't think, right?
You can ask it to do a
Okay.
group level.
It'll spit
approach,
it out, you
yeah.
push a button, and there it is.
Yeah.
Can you have it combine both the plot diagram and the heat map?
Yep. I'm not sure necessarily within the Toby suite, but that's something I've seen done in other areas. I've also seen a form of a path diagram that was like more of a group summative thing, and so on average, where each people went, color coded for how dense it was. But that was more like secondary MATLAB kind of fancier data analysis stuff. Okay. So that's all about eye tracking and eye tracking data. One thing that's really important when you start to think about MRI is you have to have a really strong grasp of the eye tracking data, or it gets really complicated fast. So one of the big issues, the perennial issue I feel like with MRI is you've got a big magnet, and most eye trackers are made out of metal, so the two don't play nicely. So there are a few models. Typically, they're the goggle style models that I was pointing out earlier, that have been made to be MR safe, more or less MR compatible, and basically you run the wires a really long far ways away and heavily shielded cables so that you get an eye tracking image. I will say that there is magnetic interference from the magnet no matter what. So that is an issue there.
What about coil size? Because I know that even our like
Yeah.
MR compatible lenses
Yes.
don't work well
Yeah.
with the better coil.
So I can't speak to every model, but the model that I've used with in an MRI compatible approach was a very thin individual goggle, and it fit in the gap in between the head coil because there was space for so that you could see the mirror. It was very narrow and very tight. That's definitely an issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you couldn't have a big fancy goggle setup in there and still get the coil on. Absolutely. The way most people do fMRI eye tracking research, not that it's a huge corpus of work, but usually what happens is you design an MRI task, and then you have them do the task both inside the scanner and then outside the scanner with the eye tracker. So you essentially duplicate the task. And that works pretty well. That's probably the most straightforward way to implement it. The problem is you kind of lose a lot of continuity between what happened in the scanner at a trial by trial level. It's kind of hard to pair the data exactly. So usually what you end up with is in your second level fMRI model, you essentially have some variable about what they did during the eye tracking task. So it's useful, but it doesn't give you a lot of information about what really happened at a given moment in the MRI. So for the brave or foolhardy people, either way, you could use this MR compatible eye tracker. And what's nice is that with some rudimentary syncing, you know exactly where they were looking at which point, and you can use that as a regressor in your MRI data. So to delve kind of back into some of our MRI methods, so the way I've used eye tracking data, and I've seen other implementations, is to basically use a parametric regressor. So you have a whole series of trials where you're doing a task, and you pull out some variable from each trial from your eye tracking data, and then you essentially create an effect that modulates some change. So the example that I'll pull later is I was interested in what proportion of the time they were looking at the eyes of a face versus other areas. So what that allows to pull out is essentially whatever you're setting up in that case, how the activation looks different when you are gazing towards the eyes of the stimuli as opposed to some other part of the face. So that's a pretty powerful effect because basically you're including that at every single trial, and if you do 50 trials, there's a lot of variability you can access with that. So let me dive into the time that I've implemented this. So the fMRI task is actually pretty simple. It's pitched as a gender discrimination task. So effectively, you have a fixation cross to get ready for your stimuli. You're presented with a face stimuli. You have to use a button box to say, is this a boy or a girl, or female or male, what have you. And then there's a jitter in between, and it just repeats a lot of times. The reason it's set up with this is there are emotional faces that are presented, and so those are designed to elicit activity in the amygdala and other face processing areas. And the whole point of the gender task, the argument is that it'll eliminate sort of this more deep emotion processing that you would get if you were asked to say, is this a happy face or a fear face, with the idea that to just get kind of the immediate pulse of seeing a particular emotional face. So I pulled in eye tracking data from the MR-compatible eye tracker to examine the proportion of gaze to the eyes for every trial. So when we just look at what this task does, there's pretty broad overall activation, which is common to tasks like this or the Hariri task. You get a lot of areas. Importantly, there was bilateral amygdala activation. And there were differences between different emotional conditions. They saw happy faces, fear faces, sad faces, and angry faces. And there were differences between those emotions, also against baseline and neutral. So neutral is a big comparison in some of these face stimuli studies. People really like to compare against neutral. It's hard to get differences versus neutral, but we were able to find some here. And this is just activation and deactivation throughout the brain. So the specific areas of interest in the brain decided beforehand were in the amygdala here. And this is the graph of the overall activation of all the faces. And when we actually factor in the influence of gaze to the eyes trial by trial, we find that there's really no specific effect in the amygdala on gaze, whether they're looking at the eyes or not. What's interesting about all this is there is, if you just look at the mean levels and don't dig down into the trial by trial level, there are some effects, but when you control for the real data as it comes through neurally, there aren't a lot of differences.
So the amygdala on the top, that's just an ROI?
This is the overall task amygdala activation that came out, but gaze didn't influence it in any way.
It's that really bright spot in the middle. Is that just because that was where the fixation cross was?
Yeah, so this is a little bit, I'll get to that in just a second. So this was sort of surprising because we were expecting there to be gaze effects, and this is part of my thought process on eye tracking data, is it can be really important because you would think there would be a gaze effect, but when you really drill down, there might not be, or it might be specific to this task. So as you're pointing out, Roberto, there's a big dense part here. This is effectively a heat map, and the red outline is the eye region, which you can tell is pretty broad here. So part of what might be the reason why we're not seeing gaze-related effects here is we placed the fixation target right here in the middle of the face. It was the same spot for everybody. But our presentation speed was relatively fast for this task. And part of what I think might be going on is because you have this fixation cross in the beginning, the face snaps on, you're automatically looking there. Then you move to start doing visual scanning, but there's not quite enough time to jump to another region. So this was kind of interesting. So it gave us a couple pieces of information. One is we probably don't need to worry in this task too much about where visual attention is being directed, because they essentially have to start in the same place, and they don't have time to scan the face in a lot of different ways.
What was your trial duration again?
This was 250 milliseconds. So it's really, for
So
the
you think
task
that, like-
design, it's way too short.
Yeah.
But the task existed and we added eye tracking, so that's another moral. So I think this gives some information. People who are doing fast presentation faces probably don't need to worry about as much where the gaze is being directed. But if you want to do a real face scanning protocol, you're going to need a longer duration of trial. Was basically where this ended up leaving off. So with that, I want to jump over to the pros and cons. So when you combine eye tracking and fMRI in the scanner, you really get like an unparalleled amount of ground truth. You know effectively where their eyes are looking, and using that as a proxy to say if their eyes are directed to a location, they're likely attending to it. Yep.
Do you sort of account for a lag time because bold is slower than eye?
Yes. Yeah, that's part of the modeling ends up taking that into account. Yeah. That would be another thing too. If you had a longer trial duration, you'd have a little more data to model too.
Right.
So there's pros and cons there. So really you're getting information about what's really happening behaviorally, not just something from a button box that will tell you, oh, they must have directed their attention sometime during this period and pushed a button. The problem though is you really do get a fair amount of attrition in your data, because you basically have two modalities that you're combining that basically you need a lot of QC, and there tends to be data attrition no matter what. So I just have an example here. This is the table of the original number of fMRI subjects, in case you were worried about how much power I had. The original sample was 213 people. Of those, we were able to, for various issues, we're able to actually scan 184 people. But after you factored out behavioral data issue and data quality, we go down to 140, and then you kill another 30 people with people who have good eye tracking calibration. So 200 people is expensive. It's way more expensive if you're paying double if eye tracking is the point. Now this is an example in a larger study where eye tracking wasn't necessarily the focus, but I was there every session making sure data quality was good, and this is how good we ended up.
What is adults?
These are adolescents,
Adolescents.
yeah. But they were effectively adults because they were 17, 18 for the most part. Some were a little bit younger.
So I'll say I was involved in a couple studies with eye tracking and fMRI with younger adolescents, some
Yeah.
kind of anxious adolescents. I cursed it so much. 'Cause
Yeah.
It was so, because I mean, it's hard enough to get a kid in there and to get, trained and test, but then we always had to spend another 10 minutes going back and forth trying to get the calibration right. And a lot of times we said, screw it, just go, we don't want the eye tracking. And even when we got it, it was really, you really have to care a lot about the eye tracking question if you're gonna try to incorporate it. I mean, there are times when it's good, but it really is.
Yeah.
I'd be cautious about going into it, 'cause it's not as easy.
Yeah, I would echo that. I would say definitely that it has to be, to do combined eye tracking and fMRI, it really needs to be the central focus of your design.
Yeah.
And there are a number of design factors that I could touch on at some point.
What about,
Could you I'm just
do
thinking
eye tracking
instead
with
of
the
having to deal with the whole tube and everything
Yeah.
else, it's like the people who are getting intracranial electrodes are sitting in a bed, their electrodes aren't
Yep.
flipping. You get direct like then you wouldn't have to worry about lag time because presumably the only lag time would be the like response time
That would be
physiological.
definitely
Yeah.
easier. There still are issues that you're bringing into it. If you're in the hospital bed, for example, and you have to have them be, still,
Certain,
and everything has to be,
Yeah.
that adds a level of complexity,
Right.
but that would be easier.
That's a particular piece. So with ECOG, you would not have the issue of data interference, but with EEG, it is actually a problem to have the eye tracking device sometimes close or in the room sometimes, even with these free mounted eye trackers. So there is some data quality
Why
loss
is that?
issue there. It's another magnetic device in close proximity, and you're measuring.
Does
It
the
generates
magnet-
interference
It
and
involves magnets in the eye tracker?
or not electronic data. It interrupts the electrical field.
Okay.
You can talk to
Andrew about that.
you can talk to Andrew about or somebody with more experience with EEG, but that's part of the reason why a lot of people do their EEG scans like in a contained shielded box, basically. Box room is to reduce those kinds of factors. So you're still gonna, it's not quite the same as the level you would get with fMRI, but there's even, with a lot of these approaches, you would even get some data loss otherwise. I will say that I was very pleased to only lose 65 or to keep 65% of the data moving from people who went from fMRI to eye tracking scanning. So that's another reason though to really, if you want to do it, you need to make your experiment about the eye tracking. There's also a lot of under the hood data management things where you can design your task to feed in the eye tracking data, and that aids a lot with presentation quality and that kind of thing. So this is the essential problem. Basically, this is an example of a really good eye tracking calibration. For each eye, it was able to see all the corners of the screen as well as the center pretty accurately. This is this is actually like a moderately bad calibration quality. But when you have this data, you tend to lose the signal a lot more and kind of question, the accuracy of your data. And there's a lot of data analytic approaches that you can use to help correct these kinds of miscalibrations, but it's another extra additional step. So lots of QC involved.
Yeah, so basically what you're doing with the calibration,
Yeah.
are you gonna talk about that? Or?
No, I wasn't going to.
You
but
get
yeah.
you get a certain number of points, and you say this is what the eye looks like, the XY coordinate looks like when they are looking at this region. You do it for 4, 5, sometimes 9 regions, and then from that you extrapolate mathematically that if that it looks like here and here, the center point is here, right corner is here, then you have a mathematical formula that if they're over here, then that must mean they're over here. So if you have bad calibration, everything looks like terrible. Like it's using flawed data to build this model on.
Yeah.
Another thing that can happen sometimes is you get them set up just right, and then they drift over time.
Yeah.
They move or something, and then everything kind of gets
Yeah, so to touch on that a little bit, that's a little bit in the step where I was saying about projecting from 3D viewing angle space to a flat 2D space. That's how it's accomplished, is through that calibration set. So this is another important thing about, like, experimental design is really important here too. Like, for example, in ours, the drift you were mentioning, where your calibration can be good at the beginning, but if you are standing static and then move, and lean this way, like you can imagine a lot of adolescents, kids, teenagers, or adults fidgeting. So often there are mini calibration events that are used to help address these kinds of problems. So there's a lot of really good design approaches to minimize that, but it is a kind of a recurring issue. So the other approach that I mentioned in the beginning, again, this is like the lower risk option. The quality of data is less, but it's a lot easier to run. So basically, if you duplicate your task outside of the scanner, the main con is that you have a narrower set of questions. You ask something about the overall pattern in trials or of a certain type of face, but you can't drill down to the moment by moment effects. So most of your analysis are usually at the level of subjects. However, the main pro is fMRI is expensive. So if you bring somebody in and you scan them once, it's pretty expensive. So much so in some places where you can't afford to reacquire them or run them a second time. That said, if you have a good fMRI task and you're able to run them and get the data, and then you're doing an outside the scanner eye tracking task, and something's just messed up, you could bring them back with relatively low cost another day to redo it, or you could have them take a break and try again at the task. So you can get that data much more cheaply, and that would boost a lot of these like calibration kind of problem issues. Because lots of different things can interrupt things. Certain kinds of eye makeup. In older models, the fit to certain distances of eye color and pupil would cause problems. Mismatch in certain combinations of skin tone and hair tone would mess things up. Our biggest problem in our data was we were dealing with 15 to 17, 18-year-olds, and there was a lot of mascara, and that kind of messes with the eye detection. So if I could say anything from that list, it's like get a makeup wipe right before and just take off anything there. Because it's all based on just the visual look of the eye. So there's a lot of things you can do to tweak this. I would say if someone were really interested in implementing some of these eye tracking approaches, I would definitely start with something that's outside the scanner and you do another task. And if you're finding really fascinating data and really want to drill down, you could consider devoting a small amount of some larger project to trying to find something in eye tracking, but you've really got to want it. So that's what I'd say there. All right. Are there any questions folks have about eye tracking and eye tracking data?
I have one about the calibration.
Sure.
Go back a couple slides.
Yeah.
What exactly do those lines mean? Does that mean that's where it tracked them looking for that bad calibration?
Yeah, so what you're getting at with these lines are basically, this is a projection of the individual data gaze points. So the ends of these lines are how many each dot is an individual sample of the eye tracker. And then to aid the visual gaze, what it does is it draws a line back to where it should be. So each of one of these are gaze points. So in this case with the right eye, this is where they're supposed to fall, and they fall in a pretty close in a circle, but way out here.
So you tell them to look at this area,
Yes.
and then you sort of push a button.
Right.
Looking at that area, and then you test it again, right?
Yes.
So this is
Yeah.
what they look like when you're supposed to be looking at those circles.
Yeah.
That's what the computer is telling you they're looking at.
So discrepancies like this, where one fixation where people are like a little bit shifted, that's a lot easier to handle. The most problematic point here in this calibration, for example, is this one. So these are all shifted a little bit down and to the left, but this one is shifted upwards, so they're just getting really bad signal for this point. There are lots of ways to recalibrate, so you can repeat the procedure and the data model gets refit, and you can get better calibration. Often it's not too bad to get decent calibration. The problem is you tend to either be able to get pretty good calibration pretty quickly, or you persist 3 or 4 times and you just cannot get a good calibration. So that's part of the data concerns with that. Yeah. Sure.
So you said that the pro for using this eye tracker is to see how the brain activation is different, whether you're looking at the eyes or the mouth.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, why do you guys use it?
Okay, so this was for a previous study. In our current studies, we're using it more often to kind of see whether there are differences in sort of how quickly someone goes to look at a face depending upon the emotion expression. So we have a kind of a visual scanning procedure where we have a grid of faces, and their task is to look for a specific type of face. And we're interested more in the scanning of which faces they go to, how long they takes them to find it, depending upon different emotional congruities or incongruities. The other thing that people use a lot in terms of tasks for eye tracking are things like scanning speed, so or like a processing speed task where you've got to find the X in a field of slightly X-like T's, that kind of thing. Or often it's used in scanning of visual scenes. So there's a lot of visual scene work that uses eye tracking.
In terms of like there's a whole lot of reasons to do it outside the scanners because you want to understand visual attention, kids reading or something. But inside the scanner, the added advantage is that you can define with more precision. So usually, like in the scanner, you have an image, a picture or something, and you try to have a whole bunch of the same kind of picture, and maybe you have a picture of a scary face and a not scary face, or you have a picture of a scene that's got some stuff in it. And you assume that the differences in different people is when they see the picture. But when you do the eye tracking, you can say precisely when they're looking at this, maybe a guy with a gun in the picture. Every time they look at the gun, they get a certain brain activation. So you can sort of more carefully calibrate the brain to their actual visual processing inside the, that's what people are excited about doing
And
it.
kind of like what Witt's experiment was sort of investigating was, that you often get amygdala activation to emotional faces. Is that, let's drill down into that, finding more. Is it because of you're looking at the eyes and that's maybe what's driving it? And it seems like maybe no. Or, trying to understand better like the types of activations that you do typically see.
Right, there was for the eye, and I think it was a really good example. There's this whole thing about autistic kids. They show these faces. Autistic kids don't have a typical amygdala response to faces. And then there was a bunch of studies saying, well, they actually don't look at the eyes. And the reason, whenever you look at the eyes, you get amygdala activation based on some other studies. So maybe what's happening is that they're just not looking at the eyes. It's not that they're processing the whole face, but it's just specifically looking at the eyes. And they did eye tracking outside the scanner, and they found that, oh, look at that. These kids who have these autistic kids who have really low activation of amygdala to faces are also ones who don't look at the eyes. So that's kind of what this whole line of research was about, whether eye activation specifically is activating amygdala, and that's an important part of sort of processing faces.
Yeah. Another example kind of in the clinical area is there's a lot of work with this in like both anxiety and depression. So there's a lot of question of, do people who are anxious, do more poorly in certain behavioral tasks or take longer to look at things because they're averting their gaze from particular stimuli or because they're over-focusing on it. And there may even be different subtypes in different groups. Some people might be overly fixating on, an emotional stimuli when it's not helpful to them, or they might be averting from it. And in this kind of paradigm, you could separate those out, and if you combine them with fMRI, you could ask if there are neural differences in those groups controlling for these other behavioral factors.
So use a lot with like attentional bias tasks
Yeah.
and threat
Yeah.
perception.
I've seen it used as a validation for a dot probe task to see if they were really doing it, that kind of thing. There's a bunch of different stuff. It would be really helpful, I think, in the future too, for they have these sort of passive viewing, like they watch a movie or a tape or a scene or that kind of thing. You could use your actual eye tracking data then to define points in the scene, like when they're looking at a person or when they're looking at a person doing a certain type of action, that kind of thing. So there's some potential there. just because those are more naturalistic. So I think there's a lot of different potential applications.
So I would say that doing eye tracking inside the MRI is really challenging, and I would not advise it unless you have a really good reason. But doing it outside the scanner is really easy, and we have an eye tracker. That is research institute money, so people can use it. If anybody wants to do it, it's cheap, you know, and you can do it. You can, with very little training, you can collect the data. I think it's a great technology, but not in the MRI environment.
This is another point to plug too. We have a very high sampling.
Great MRI.
Well, we have a high sampling eye tracker, and we have a high sampling near infrared spectroscopy or FNIRS setup, which has a very similar sampling rate conveniently. So there is some potential in the future for tasks that might do neural data. Yeah, and that could easily be an analog to a different kind of an imaging or an MRI task. There's a lot of flexibility there. But at the very least, it may be a very interesting way to incorporate some more detailed behavioral data into your neuroimaging studies. But I wouldn't jump into sticking it in the scanner unless you're really committed. All right. Okay, thank you very much. I'll go ahead and stop that there.